I'm going to be doing a demo on a bowl from a board. If you remember, last January, the last meeting that we had at Advantage Lumber was a demonstration that was put on by Frank, Jim Titze, who I see is on the screen here tonight, and Russ Fellows on bowls from a board. And then the following day, we had a workshop here in Frank's shop. And then everything broke loose. And so that was the last workshop that we had last year. But anyhow, that was enough to whet my interest. And so tonight I'm going to be doing a little bit of review of what they talked about, but also I'm going to take it a little bit farther with regards to design and just trying to go through some tips that I've just fallen into primarily through making mistakes that hopefully will help you. So a bowl from a board, hang on if I get this thing on my head here. I'm falling off here. Does this expand so I can get it? Let's try this. There, that feels better. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me out there?
Yes.
Okay, good.
It looks a lot better.
It was sure uncomfortable before. Okay, well, a bowl from a board is really quite literal. And so tonight we're going to confine my remarks to bowls that can be made from a single board. And in essence, what it is several pieces that are cut out, stacked, glued together, and turned. So just as a very minimal sneak preview, I'll keep this together. Whoops. Hopefully this gives you the idea that this is just a single board and concentric circles were drawn on it, and then they were cut apart, and then these can be stacked. And that's kind of the essence of what it is, but we're going to go into much more detail. So if we're trying to do this all from one board, then one of the restrictions is that the angle of cut on each of these, as you can see, has to be 45 degrees so that they line up. So before we dive into any more specific technique, I think it's sometimes helpful to see what the point is going to be. So what I want to do is show you some slides. Scott Heim has done a fantastic job of taking pictures that were kind of a mishmash that I provided to him. I don't know all this thing about formatting and everything, but anyhow, he has put these together. And so what I'm going to do is show you a few samples that are kind of in a progression of what we are going to be working towards by the end of the evening. This is basically going to be a fairly detailed show and tell rather than an actual turning session, because we just had two very good turning sessions on bowls. So Scott, why don't you go ahead, go to picture one, please. So there was interest expressed just a few minutes ago in visiting people's shops. So I'll take just a minute. This is my shop. I'm in a single stall of a two-car garage. So behind me in that picture would be a small DeWalt job site saw, table saw, and a small planer. And then the big green thing there, that's my lathe from 1995. Any of you who have been around for quite a while know that back in the 90s, Craft Supply was in business in Utah, as they still are, and the lathe they were pushing at that time was the Woodfast. At that time, they were still made in Australia, and they were quite a good lathe, but at that time you can see that there was no opportunity for outboard turning, and although it has a DC motor, it does not have reverse, but it has served me well. You can also see that it's a very short bed, and they referred to it as a bowl lathe because that's what I'm interested in. And so it has a 20-inch swing on it, but it's not very long. The actual story is we were living in Minnesota at the time. My wife gave me, as a gift, an opportunity to go up for a weekend 200 miles away and turn with a fellow who turned out just to be a gem of a guy. And I went up there. I had a fantastic time with him. It'd be like you guys coming and spending a weekend with Frank. And I had a great time. I came home and I ordered the lathe that's got 1995 stamped right in the ways. And within a couple of weeks, I figured out that I had a full-time job, 4 kids, and it's a whole lot harder, or I needed a whole lot of guidance that wasn't available. And so it went into storage until I got back to Florida here and became a member of this club about 7 years ago. And so any progress that I've made in the last 7 years, I owe to this club and its members. So you can see it's up on some 4x4s to get it jacked up to my height. And then the columns are filled with bird shot. And then there's some steel beams across the back where those 4x4s extend out behind it just to take any vibration out of it. Then I have a 18-inch bandsaw over there. It's hard to see in the background there, a drill press. And then I have a thickness planer and a sander on these carts like you can see on the left. And I can spin those around, bring them out, connect them to the dust collection. Next picture, please. That's just a picture of the dust collection coming down from the ceiling and going to the lathe and then on over to the thickness planer there. My workbench I built myself because I wanted something that was at my height, something that was comfortable. And then on the bottom shelf there, you can see there's a air compressor, and so I can just pull that up and blow particularly hollow forms out. And then there's a vacuum pump on the end of the table there so that I can do vacuum chucking. So that's it for the shop. It's small, but it gets the job done for him, and I spent a lot of time there and thoroughly enjoy it. So now let's go on to those sample bowls. These are bowls that I've made. You'll see them in the flesh here a little later on, but these are kind of a progression. These are all bowls from a board. That's just maple with some embellishment with some walnut. Next one, please. That one's maple, again, with walnut, and all that is 2 boards stacked on top of each other and then cut as this one I showed you before. And then a rim of maple that is a beautiful piece of wood that a violin maker gave me. Next picture. This one now is, yes, go ahead.
What do you do for a finish?
All of these are wipe-on poly. This one hurt a little bit. You'll see this one in the making a little bit. For my 25th anniversary 27 years ago, I made my wife a stereo cabinet with Queen Anne legs and all that, which has become severely outdated. I finally convinced her she didn't need to save it for sentimental value. I put it on Craigslist, couldn't even get $50 for it. So one day I went out in the garage with the Sawzall and had at it and decided to recreate it as bowls. So this is a cherry with some strips of maple or birch in between. Next slide. This one is a 14-inch ash bowl, and the difference here is this one now has some wedges in it. Next one. This is the next step in the progression. This one has both wedges and stripes. And I think the next picture is the same bowl. Yeah, just from the top. So that one is birch. The vertical stripes are walnut, and then the purple is indeed Purple Heart. Okay, we're going to switch over now. You can to look up at this graft. That's Mohs clue. All these bowls have basically a V shape because you have to understand this bit for things to be able to stack up appropriately, to be able to get this out of just one board. So if you can see up here, cuts through the board, and I hope you can see that this outline in green, and what you probably cannot see is grid on this, so all this is drawn to scale. And there you can see the grid a little. So this is drawn to scale. So in this case, it's a 3/4 inch board, and if it's going to be 45 degrees, okay, the distance between the cuts needs to be equivalent to the height of the board. That results in a 45-degree angle. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I'll try to raise this arm. Let me know if this works. Okay. So all I'm trying to show there is that they line up perfectly. Okay, can you see that? Now, Mo, come on down to the next one down. So this is drawn to scale. Yeah, right there. This one's drawn to scale to a 1/2 inch. So if the board is a 1/2 inch thick, then it's also, the circles would be drawn a 1/2 inch apart. That gives you the 45-degree angle, which would let them stack up. Now, I made one fairly deep bowl using 1/2 inch thick wood like that. And what happens then is you have a fairly deep bowl that is never any thicker than 1/2 inch. And we all know when we're making bowls, it's nice to have some mass at the bottom, but you don't have that luxury. So the thought struck my head, well, what happens if I cut the circles out farther apart so that the circles are wider? So in this first example up here, the cuts are 3/4 inch apart, but in 1/2 inch wood. And you can see what happens here is all that happens is the overlap stays the same. And if we come down here, a little lower there, whoa, yeah, here we go. If you stretch them out to 1 inch in a 1/2 inch thick board, then, I'm trying to get my finger in the right place, then the overlap, again, is exactly the same. So there is no advantage to trying to stretch out the distance between your concentric circles. All that happens is you get less circles per board, less height to your bowl, but you don't get any increased wall thickness to work with. So does that make sense? So really the ideal thing, I think, is if you draw your concentric circles, the distance that's equal to the height of the board plus the kerf of the saw, then you're going to wind up with optimum thickness to work with as you're turning the board. In reality, kerf thickness doesn't make that much sense, so I tend to just draw my concentric circles at the distance that's equivalent to the height of the board. Okay. Can you go to picture?
Do you make them in half circles or full circles?
Yeah, I will get to picture 9. So for starters, what we need are 2 boards that are twice as long as they are wide, so that when you put these together, the board winds up being just as wide as it is long. So basically a square. Now, to save some wood, I cut off the corners of the square here. Can you go to picture 15, please? In gluing up, the clamps that you see there are called parallel clamps. That would be one like this. And these jaws are perfectly parallel. And then there's the rail in between that they ride on. I finally went out and bought them. Yeah, because I was using clamps like this, I kept running into problems. The reason is that I could not rest the boards down on here to be able to push down so that all the boards in the glue up stayed exactly in the same plane. So you have this just floating, basically, and as you close down on the boards, this is exerting rotational torque on the last board, and if you have a slippery glue joint there, it tends to rotate it out of alignment. The other thing is, if you don't have this perfectly in line with the middle of the board, then it tends to make some bowing. And as you can see, this really isn't lined up now. As you tighten it down, this moves a little bit. And so all of that leads to the possibility of your board being bowed. And if you wind up with a glue up that's bowed, you're going to have problems down the line. Conversely, the one you see in the picture there, those boards are all resting on the rail of the clamp. The orange parts at the ends are parallel, and so they bring everything together very nicely, and it kind of eliminates that problem. One other problem is that inevitably some glue will be stretched out or squeezed out. So picture 16 for a minute, please. So when I had that on the parallel clamps before, I had wax paper underneath, and on the top side, which is exposed to me, as you squeeze it together, you can just take a damp cloth or whatever. I usually just take a razor blade, scrape most of it off, then take a damp cloth, wipe that off, and so the one surface is perfect, or very good at least. But the other side winds up looking like this. And so I found that the easiest way to get that off is to use one of these Sureform rasps. So you can see on the front half there, that first line between the light and the dark, I already used the rasp on there. It took off all the glue, but it did not damage the wood. And the back part, you can see there's still glue there that needs to be taken off. So that's a technique that has really been very helpful. A Sureform, I think you might be able to read it right there on the picture, but they're made by Stanley. It comes in a hand size, which is what this one is, like a small block plane. And then it also comes in a much longer one, but the short one works most easily. Okay, picture 10. So what we're going to do then is we're going to measure our board for thickness, and then we're going to make concentric circles that distance apart. And for some reason, like an idiot, initially I would just make a center circle and then start. Invariably, I'd wind up with some wasted wood at the edge. It makes a lot more sense, if this is a 3/4 inch board, to start at the very edge or perimeter, mark 3/4 of an inch in progressively towards the center point, which is that black dot in the middle, and that way you get to use the most wood. Generally, you really don't care if there's a little bit of size variability in your base. The next picture, 11, I believe it is. On this picture, the only point of that is to show that the centermost line there is broken. In other words, it's not complete. It does not cross the midline. And the reason I do it that way is if I draw it across the midline, I tend to lose myself when I get over to the bandsaw and cut that out. I really don't want that circle cut out. What that circle is indicating to me is that that is the diameter of the base of the internal portion of the bowl. So if you can see this here, there's a line on there. This lines up with that line. So imagine this is the dotted one. It just lets me know what the base of my bowl is going to be in terms of size. Okay. There, as we learned last year from Frank and Russ and Jim, they each demonstrated a different way of cutting out the circles. You can do it with a tool called the Ringmaster. I don't have one. I looked up this morning, so I always see their ads in the back of the AAW Journal, and the cheapest one was $539, so that was a non-starter. The second way is to turn them on a lathe and just use a parting tool, and you can pretty accurately judge the 45-degree angle or make yourself a little jig so that you get started in the right direction. That works. It does require some prep to get your board affixed to a backer board somehow to control it. So for my purposes, the next slide, please. I use my bandsaw. The table will easily go up to 45 degrees. And I will just use this as an opportunity to say that in doing these bowls in general, it is important to have the degrees set precisely, particularly on your table saw when you're cutting out your strips. If they're not right at 90 degrees, they're not going to match up, and you're going to have bad glue joints. So next picture. It's basically just the same thing, but actually on the bandsaw cutting out the circles, and it's really not very difficult to do. Next picture, please. That's the 1/4-inch blade. I get all my blades from a place up in Atlanta. What is it, Frank? The wood slicer blade people. Highland Wood Turning. They have some general blades. This is the 1/4-inch one, but then I do all my resawing using their 3/4-inch wood slicer blade, which does a fantastic job. We'll get into that here in a few minutes. So to answer Charlie's questions from a few minutes ago, when you're using a bandsaw, then you have to cut out half circles and then subsequently put them together. So in this picture, you can see the circles have been cut out of the left side there, and the center ones are starting to stack up, just so you get the idea how that happens. The right side of the pictures, those still need to be cut out. Next picture, please. Oops, that's not the one. Let's go to, yeah, that's what I want. Okay, the only point of that is that there's an A and a B marked on the rings so that you can keep track of which side is which. Because later on, when you were stacking the rings to glue them together, if there's any disparity in the width, say, of that walnut section that has the actual mark on it, and you wind up putting a B over an A, then your lines, the vertical lines there, are not going to line up correctly, and it doesn't take much for them to look really lousy. So unless they are exact, you want to keep your sides straight like that. Okay, picture 18, please. So the next step then is to glue the two sides together to form complete rings. That white background that those two rings are on is a piece of granite. I went dumpster diving with permission at a local granite shop, and that square piece of, it's not granite, but quartz, was there. It's a wonderful thing to glue on because it's perfectly flat, and the glue that squeezes out does not stick badly to it. And so you can free these up from that surface once they've dried quite easily. And then any glue that's on the quartz, you can either wash it off with a damp cloth or just take a razor blade if it's gotten dried and just scrape it off. So that works very, very well. Now, this is a point that can be problematic, because if you did not have your table saw set at the 90 degrees and you try and bring those joints together and they just don't come, you can make adjustments, but it's not easy and it's very problematic. The adjustment is usually made by sanding, and it's hard to get one end on the sander without touching the other end, but it's got to be very close, otherwise you're not going to be square. You know, you're going to angle the thing the other direction. And then if you take anything off that midline, then what that does is it draws, in this case, those two white lines closer together. And so when you try and line them up with the next ring, then they're just not going to line up. And again, it's going to look lousy. Unfortunately, I've got some examples of that to show you later on. Okay, picture 19, please. This is the first bowl I made, and you can see if you're looking carefully at all, really have this picture on there to show the press. This is just something I made. I've got it here, but I guess the picture shows it as well as anything. And I just sequentially stack the rings on there and then use the press to squeeze them down. One of the things that I learned early on was, and this is early on because it's his first bowl, there's just one washer there. And if you tighten that nut down with just one washer there, it exerts a little rotational force to that piece of plywood, which exerts a little bit of rotational force to the walnut piece underneath it. And then you're backing everything off again and trying to get everything lined up again. If you put two washers there so that the slippage is between the washers, it basically eliminates that problem. Now, there's a couple ways of doing this. Some people like to build the bowl on their lathe, and so they will affix the outer ring to a piece of MDF or something like that with some hot glue, and then bring subsequent rings up and then use the tailstock to provide compression to hold them in place as they glue. There is one nice advantage to doing that, and that is that the rings need to be trued up between each. Before you put the next ring in, you have to true the first one up, and every step you have to do that retruing up just to make sure that there's no little wisp of glue that's extending out from the glue joint, or that things have gotten a little out of shape somehow. And so if you're doing that on the lathe, you can just bring your banjo up, rest the board with sandpaper on there, push it against the ring that's going around and around, and that'll true it up really quite easily. The disadvantage, I think, of using the lathe, and the reason I don't use it, is that particularly when you have multiple stripes going through your board, it's really hard to keep all those in view and keep them lined up, and that is crucial. The joint is initially slippery with the glue. It gets a little sticky fairly quickly, but it's sticky at first. I mean, a little slippery at first, and so things want to slide around. And so you get one side lined up, and then you can't see the other, so you have to bring the lathe around half a rotation. You're a little bit out there, make adjustment, you go back over to the other side, and it just gets to be a never-ending game. And the other problem you can see from this picture is that almost all the glues, and in mine, this is all Tight Bond 2, although the glue dries clear, it's milky or murky when you first put it on, and you don't have an absolute complete view of that line. Yeah, and so you wipe away there where that cross is and everything, try to get as good a view as you can. For my money, the best view is to have it on a press where I can just hold the piece, rotate it around, then tighten down, and I'm looking down, seeing all the points that need to correlate with one another all at one time. It's just an easier way for me to do it. That works until the end. The next picture, let's see what that is. That piece, the last one, obviously there's a hole down the middle, so I cannot ratchet down on that with the press, and so I just generally stick two of my chucks on top of it, get it in position, put two chucks on there. They're both pretty heavy, and get a little pressure on there. And the next picture. And then for the final step, then I do usually have a foot, if I'm going to use a foot, and a waste block that are on a face plate like that I've turned down, and now they're in my tailstock. And then I put the board up against that. That's actually a piece of sandpaper there, and I've got one of those ring drawers on there that just helps me center it. And then just let's see, the next picture may show. No, it didn't. Anyhow, it just compresses it together. I've tended to use more face plates recently. Some of them I did just using a chuck, and in that case, I would have the tenon turned on that piece that I showed you a minute ago that comprises the foot and the waist block. Have that all done in advance, and then glue it together. This picture and the next one, the only point of these two pictures, toggle over to the next one for just a minute. Now toggle back to the first one, please. You can see there's a space between the edge of the bowl and my tool rest there. So in the process of cutting these out, they're not perfect circles, and in the process of stacking them, they're not perfect circles. And so that's the gap that exists there. And so one of the first things you need to do when you're actually in the turning process is to true that up. And so I found that the best thing to do is true up that rim and then start going from the rim towards the foot with a gouge to establish a true circle there right off the bat. You can see that you're losing a, a fair amount of the wall thickness just by doing that. So I'm not going to talk a whole lot about turning specifically, but just a couple tips. The next picture. All right. A couple things I found is that I do the outside first. And to facilitate that, what I will frequently do is bring up a jam chuck from my tailstock into the inside of the bowl. Now, the inside of the bowl, go back one picture again, Scott, I'm sorry. The inside of the bowl, you can see it's fairly rough there. It's got all the glue joints. So what I do is bring that jam chuck up, see where it's going to hit in there, and then I turn just enough on the inside that I can put that jam chuck in there against a smooth surface, and it just helps give some stability to the bowl wall as I then go back and turn the outside. On the outside, we're all familiar with gouges, but I have not used carbide tools much at all, but I've had this one sitting on my shelf forever and didn't know what on earth to do with it. But this, it really works on the... So this is just the biggest easy wood turning tools. Let's see, which camera am I? There we go. The biggest easy wood turning tools. And as you know, the cutters come in perfectly square. They come in what's called an R2 and an R4. That refers to the radius of the outer circle on these. In other words, it's a rounded cutter. And the R2, of course, is more rounded than the R4. This is an R2. And I found that this tool is very effective in getting off those glue lines and getting the initial turn down so that you can subsequently put a gouge on there without being bounced so much. When I'm turning the inside, then, just stay there for a minute. Then I found that the use of a steady rest like this is very, very helpful. The one in the picture is one that I made shortly after Bill had talked about using one on one of his projects, and they subsequently sent out some directions. I didn't wait. Subsequently, somebody asked whether it makes a difference whether you have one wheel or two wheels. And so Frank had one here, a used one, the one way with the two wheels. I got that from him, and that's what I use now. And that really does help stabilize those walls because they get to be very thin. Alrighty. Some people refer to these bowls. You want to go to two. One way of doing it is use those words economy bowls. And in a way, that's correct. If you were to make a 12-inch bowl, that would take one board foot of lumber. And most of these that you've been seeing are some maple that I bought. It cost me $3.50 a board foot, which translates then that it was basically $3.50 worth of wood going into each one of these. So that's very economical. They're also economical in that there is just a minimum of waste. My pottery neighbor, who relies on all my chips to do her firings, is really upset because I haven't been bringing her the big bags of chips recently. What I dislike about that word economy bowl is that it has the implication or connotation of being cheap or in poor taste. And I think that Michael Mode, if you're familiar with his work, has dispelled that notion, as he's done some phenomenally beautiful things using this technique. So what I'm going to do now is just show you some bowls that I've made and talk about a little bit how they were, what the setup was to accomplish that pattern. And so we're going to start off very simple, and then we're going to go a little bit on through, so where we get to a point where we're at a bowl like the one that you see on the left there now, with the wedges and also the vertical members. Yes, yeah, that's one point I meant to bring up later on or at some point, and I had not, but he's right. When you're cutting that outer edge, you don't really need, on the largest ring, you don't need to cut that at 45. You can cut that at 90, and it gives you a little bit more room to bring the sidewall of the bowl up and then curve it just a little bit to try and shy away a little bit from the 45-degree business. So I'm just going to show you some examples here. The simplest thing would be just to use a solid board. So in this particular case, this is a tree that went down in my neighborhood with Irma 2 years ago. I've just had a chunk of it laying out in my garage drying, and I finally cut it up into some pieces like this. And I just glued a little strip down the middle just to break up the grain a little bit. So this would be one side, there'd be another side, and then the circles would be drawn like that. And so that's a very simple thing. And what you wind up with is a bowl like that. Now, I had previously made just a regular bowl, if you will, out of this wood, and I thought it looked almost a little dirty. And so to try and perk this up a little bit, I put some contrast on here. And so there's actually a foot of walnut, and then if you're getting a little bit of purple there, there's some purple heart just to give it a little bit of a pizzazz. I think it makes it into a little bit nicer bowl. The other lesson I learned from this bowl was that this too has the wipe-on poly on here. And when you get wood that's spalted to this degree, there's variability in the density of the fibers. And so you just don't get a perfectly smooth sanded surface. There's always a little bit of wrinkliness to it. And so you don't get a perfectly smooth reflection from it. I maybe would have been better off oiling this. I'm not sure. Well, I think this one is probably about because I kept thinking I could do it better. And I never really could. You know, I sand it down and try it again, and it's just the wood on this one. Okay, another very simple bowl. This was just a single board of maple. The two halves, the circles drawn, stacked, glued together. And then to try and give it a little more pizzazz, then I just added a little more stylish foot to it. And then took some walnut also and made, I think it's 30 segments, and just glued those on the top. And so it's a very straightforward bowl, but I think it still has some beauty to it. The next step was basically to do that same thing, but at the glue joints, I just put in a little spline of walnut, and it just gives it a little bit more pop. And if you're not creating a bowl that has vertical lines all the way through it, then you can rotate the pieces as you glue them together. And so these are rotated around rather than just having them all in a line. This one you saw in the pictures earlier, And again, all this is a maple board and then a piece of walnut like that, just glued on the top, and then the circles cut out, and so that you wind up with this layered effect, the ringed effect. And then this is the one that has that piece of maple that the violin maker gave me, and I think it's really a beautiful board. Old stereo cabinet. And so this one now, since it has lines that go all the way through, then the seam has to be in line all the way through too. You can't rotate them out of position. And all in all, this one went well. Feel it for just a minute. This one, I think it's 12 inches and weighs 8 ounces. It's very thin, but there is one problem here that I just didn't anticipate at the time, and now I know, but it shows how little things matter. This joint, you'll take my word for it, this joint right here is, the way that happened, and because that, I'll finish that thought. It's not I glued it up and I got antsy and I it before it was thoroughly set up. And so it fell apart. So what I did was, this was just a matter of a couple of minutes. I took some more glue, put it on the end, put it together again, looked great, kept going. Well, what happened was that there was still some old glue on the joint. The new glue didn't loosen it or dissolve it or whatever the right term would be. And so the joint didn't come together quite smoothly. And I think you can see this line. Let's see, let me get you in here. How can I get this? It's not lined up quite perfectly there. It's who's got me here? Yeah, I'll take my word. You can see it's just slightly off right there. So little things like that can matter. You can play around in a number of different ways. You can play around with different woods. This one is walnut and purple heart. There are the vertical. This is dark enough. It's fairly subtle. They're the vertical stripes, and then there are also the wedges in there. But these 4 next bowls I'm going to show you were all done with the same cuttings. There was 1.5 and a 1.5. This one, the one. Over there. Oh, I'll try to stop wiggling.
Make sure the headset is plugged in. The transmitter.
I think we got it. Can you, how are we doing now? Can you hear?
Better. Yeah, much better.
Okay, I'll try not to wiggle around so much. All I'm saying is that from a design standpoint, you can, by changing your glue up, you can change where the vertical lines fall. And so on these two, this outer edge is wide, as to opposed on this one, then this is wide and this is thinner out here. It's just a matter of, you know, what suits your fancy. But my point is, there's all kinds of things that you can work with what happens and see what you like. This is wood that I had never worked with. Sepele, if I'm saying that right, S-E-P-E-L-E. And this is my wife's favorite one, so she keeps this on her desk. The next thing we're going to talk about is introducing wedges into the work, how you do that, and some of the considerations involved in doing that. Let's start with this one. I talked earlier about if you can maintain both sides being exact mirror images of one another, then you've got less chance, if you make a mistake, of not having the vertical lines line up. And so one way of getting around that is make the entire board longer than you need. And so what I would do on this, you may be able to see there's a line across here. That would be cut, and then this would be swung around, and I would wind up with a square here, and then I'd start drawing my circles. Okay. Again, it's very important that this be at a 90-degree angle. Now, if I want to put a wedge in there, then what I've got to do is cut a wedge out of this and then make a wedge to put back in, okay? There's a number of ways that can be done. I do it all on my bandsaw. I think Frank has done it in the past using a joiner planer. And in fact, if you go to our website, there is an article by a person I don't know who really gives a detailed description of bowls from a board, and he did his on a joiner. That scares the bejeebies out of me because you have to take the guard off and push the thing through there. And, you know, one of the worst injuries that I ever saw when I was in practice was a fellow who was pushing a board through on a joiner. His hand slipped off and he put his hand through the joiner. And that's just not a pretty scene at all. So I do this all on the table saw, on the bandsaw. Let's mow your arm again. Look up here. Okay, I'll try not to cut. This is again our board, looking at it from the end. The lines that are at 45 degrees are our cuts. The lines that are vertical are the seams between our boards, so we're making so we have something. This would, so here's a seam, here's a seam, here's a seam. Okay. So when you put a wedge in there, you can draw what your pieces are going to look like the same way that we did over here. When I was first making that ash bowl with the wedges in it, you can see that as the wedges get closer to the center, they get smaller in thickness. That makes sense. But when I was first trying to do this, it was actually I rejected because I put a wedge on there, but you can see it only extended all the way through the outer ring and not even to the center of the second ring. And so all you really saw on the inside was one dark spot, and it was going to look crazy. I mean, artistically, that wasn't going to be nice at all. I abandoned that and started over again and made a bigger wedge. So you want your wedge your wedge to overlap at least several of your joints, okay? And there is an advantage to that because the wedge breaks up where the line has to meet up. Let me show you what. Okay, I hope you can see on here. There's a wedge here, and it breaks up this vertical line. If I'm slightly off on my vertical line, the wedge is going to hide that for me. So although it takes a lot of work to get the wedge in there, that is one advantage of it. But I think it's prettier if you have wedges that sequentially go down. This one hits all four. Okay, let me see here for a minute. What's the next slide there? We should go to picture 26, would you? Okay, so this is a little bit about making the wedges. Most of the bowls that I make are roughly 10 inches in diameter, which means each side is going to be 5 inches. And so what I did was took a board that you can see is, roughly about 5 inches wide there, and then I put a protractor on there and went from one corner to the other and saw what degree I would have to cut that at in order to get a wedge like that. And as you can see, it comes out about 7 degrees. Next picture, please. Actually, go one more. So what I did was I ran that piece of pine there, I ran that through my table saw, ripped it at 7 degrees, and then I chamfered the bottom of the piece of particle board at 7 degrees, and then glued the two together. And well, first, before I did that, I cut off the pine board wide enough that this would then fit on my fence and create a new fence that has a 7-degree angle to it. So go back one picture, please. So all that's telling me is that this is the sled that I can use if I want a 7-degree wedge using a 3/4 inch board. Okay, skip ahead 2. So the next one more. Okay, there you go. So if I'm making a long wedge, for example, here was a board, and what I wanted to do was create it into 2 wedges. And so I secure that fence to my fence on the saw, and then I cut through and wind up with 2 pieces like this. And I don't know how, you probably can't see that real well, but this is the side that comes right off the saw. And it actually is very nice. I generally can just glue that up and not worry about it at all. Don't have to sand it or anything. The other option, however, is that, let's say this is the board I'm going to use it on. This has already been sanded. I haven't cut the wedge here yet, but I can put this on, gluing the sanded surface of my wedge board, here we go, to the sanded surface of my other board, and that way I have 2 perfectly smooth surfaces to sand together, and I'm going to get a good joint for sure that way. And it's very important that the joints turn out very nicely. If I'm using a smaller piece of wood, like these. Yeah, okay. Can you just go to me for a minute? Just get rid of that for a second. Get rid of the photograph for a minute and just go to me. Can we do that? Okay. These are fairly small boards, and they both have a wedge that I've put on there. Made these up for a couple reasons. One is to show that you can put the wedge on either side. In other words, you can have the wedge facing up or you can have the wedge facing down. And then your circles would be in here and get the cutout. All the ones that I've shown you so far, the wedge has been facing down. If the wedge is facing up, then I think you understand the process well enough now that that is going to be part of the rim. And I'm just not sure if that's what I wanted to do, so it hasn't been a priority, so I haven't tried that yet. But I think that's what I'm going to do with these two boards, is make one side where the wedge is down on one side, up on the other, so it's on the rim on one side. And so this one has two wedges, but they're both on the down-side. If one had been on the top, this color would be here and here and here. You understand what I'm trying to say there? Does that make sense? So it's just some of the variability that your design. Okay, let's go back to that next picture. It was probably 27 or something like that. Another one, one more. Okay, so here with the small pieces like that, what I do is do not fix my sled to my fence, but rather I use double-sided tape to tape the board to the sled and then push the whole sled through. It's just much safer on my fingers. And so that's how you get the two boards like that. Next picture, please. Okay, I pretty well explained that there's the surface that's the cut surface, and then there's the surface that's the sanded. You can glue using either one of those because the angle stays the same. It doesn't matter. You have to re-true up the edge of the board because that's getting too complicated. Just take my word for it. You can use either side. Okay, next picture. It does take a lot of clamping. I think you've all heard that somebody once said that you can never have too many clamps. That's absolutely true. Next picture. That was just to show that you can put it on the top or the bottom. We've already talked about that. Next picture. The reason for this picture is that it's very important when you do glue your wedge on, if you're gluing it into a board where you've already cut out a section and now you're replacing that with a wedge, that have the wedge overlap the edge of the portion you've cut off. And the reason for that is that when you get all the glue on there, there's enough moisture that what it does is if you just have a thin edge, you just have a thin edge like this, exactly in position where you want it, it warps. And you just cannot get enough clamps on there to keep that from wobbling around. So what you really want to do is have your gluing further back away from the edge, let it dry, and then run it through your sander, sand it down until you get back to your original thickness of your board, and then everything will be square and ready to go. I think that's the last picture, isn't it, Scott? Yeah. Okay, we got just a few minutes here, so I hate to show you this bowl. This is the first one I made, and there's some obvious mistakes to this. I don't know what I was doing wrong at the time, but I'll show them to you to hopefully you won't make the same mistake. The two sides, so there was a side here and a side here. So there was a walnut board, a maple, walnut, maple. And then I had put one piece of maple on one side down the middle. And then it was also glued up so that there was walnut and then maple, walnut, maple, walnut, maple, the other direction. So at some point in sanding it down, I apparently sanded too much on the maple surface side of one or too much on the walnut side of one, so that these rings, you can see they just don't meet. This ring is thinner than that ring. And that's very obvious and not appealing at all. So somehow I just wasn't using my head when I sanded things down and wound up with two different thicknesses. I can't believe that I started with two different thicknesses in the first place. So I must have screwed it up that way. Now the next problem is you can see that this line up here is much thinner than down here. And the reason was that it wound up not being flush when I brought it together. And so I had to sand the side to try and get it squared up. And like an idiot, I sanded on the side that had the maple instead of the side that had the walnut. And so it sanded that down thinner than it was lower down. So, as I said before, precision counts on these things. And so I always have to be thinking ahead and very cognizant of the symmetry to make sure that everything is going to line up perfectly. Otherwise, it just is not attractive. Okay, well, that's all I got. It's a lot of fun. I'd recommend you give it a try.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you, Jim.
The Technology Committee.
Absolutely.
How do we get a hold